Chapter 1843, The Trolley Problem. Everyone who entered behind the doors was asked this question, and each gave their own answer. For example, the arrogant Emperor Indra said, "My life is a miracle in this world. My very existence is meaningful." As the only dog among the creatures that entered behind the light doors, Brian the Labrador put his hands together and said, "This is a very serious question. You know that as a unique dog, I have a deep understanding of the world, unlike those hypocritical and ignorant humans. I often look up at the stars at night." No matter what answer they gave, in the end the young girl in red would give the same evaluation. Pass. The first level, everyone can pass. There is no standard answer, because there is no such thing as a standard answer to this kind of question. It only reflects people's understanding of the world and life. So everyone successfully reached the second level, the second world. When Jangi opened his eyes, he heard a rumbling noise in his ears. The night wind was howling. This was a huge valley, and he was standing on a speeding train. The girl in red appeared beside him again, pointing ahead and saying, "There are 5 people tied to the rail in front of us, and the train is about to run over their bodies, and they will definitely die." Then she pointed in another direction, but not far away. "There is a fork in the road. You can choose to let the train enter the new road ahead and avoid running over the 5 people. But there is also a person tied to the road. Now, what will you choose? Do nothing and let the train run over the 5 people, or turn and save the 5 people, but kill another person in the process." Jangi stood on the train, and a lever appeared at his side, which could be used to turn the train at any time. His brows furrowed deeply. At this point, he had already realized a problem. The trial of the mighty god-level civilization, the standard for selecting people, did not focus on strength, because there was no civilization that could be stronger than them. They want to select people who can solve problems that they themselves cannot solve. That must be related to a higher level of meaning, and that kind of thing comes from human nature itself. For example, the problem of the first barrier, such as this kind of human nature choice right now. The train is still some distance from the fork in the road ahead, which is enough for Jangi to think about it. He frowned, pondering exactly how to choose in order to satisfy the examiner in front of him. Almost everyone who enters the world behind the doors of light faces the same problem. It's just that the scenarios they face are different for different people. The same problem, different manifestations. For example, in Ichard's case, he saw a huge steel castle like a mountain, and on the way, he encountered a small moving castle. He couldn't stop the rapidly advancing steel castle, so it either crushed the small moving castle in front of it or the even smaller castle in the other direction. At this moment, Uncle Yu was standing in the middle of the train's driver's cab, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his sweat-soaked hands. Although he knew that everything was fake, he could hear the desperate wails of those on the railway track. Since it was a trial, there was of course a way to do something incredible. For example, the sounds of those people's wails and pleas were transmitted into his ears. The 5 people said, "If you do nothing, we will die. But you now have the power to save us. You should easily be able to choose between 1 life and 5 lives." And the person on the other railway said, "Although I am only one person, the train was not originally heading in my direction. I should not have died. If you change the direction of the train, you will be the murderer who killed me. But if you do nothing, then their deaths have nothing to do with you. Because hypothetically, if you weren't here, they would have died anyway." 2 different voices sounded in Uncle Yu's ears, leaving him in a dilemma. His hands were shaking violently, and he did not make a choice until the train finally passed by the location of the 5 people. He did not make a choice, even though there was no formal difference between choosing to run over the 5 people and choosing to do nothing. But this was a trial, and choosing to do nothing was completely different from doing nothing. So he was eliminated by the red-clad girl, and disappeared from this world as a ray of light. The next moment, he returned to the outside of the light doors, looking at the familiar scene before him. Uncle Yu sighs, but also shook his head with no regrets. And one after another, many more people were transported to the outside world. The second level of the test eliminated many people. Their choices were different. Some chose to run over and kill 5 people, while others chose to divert the path and trade 1 life for the lives of 5 people, but they were also eliminated. They looked at each other, and Uncle Yu also noticed that some members of the Volt Shadow Troop and Heavenly God Squad were here, so he went over to ask them. How did you get eliminated? Among the crowd, he saw a few familiar faces, such as Xing Tian, the person in charge of the Qingpu base. Xing Tian looked confused and shrugged. I'm not really sure. I just hesitated for a long time when I was faced with a choice. Although I changed direction at the last minute, I was still eliminated. Uncle Yu frowned and muttered, but I didn't make a choice. I just let the train continue to run normally, and I was still eliminated. So no matter what choice you make, it won't affect the result. The others also discussed this. In fact, there were only 2 choices, and everyone's reasons were more or less the same, but they weren't sure why they were eliminated. Uncle Yu let out a long sigh and said, maybe we lack a certain quality. At this time, in the middle of a huge valley, Fatty Sue was also facing the same test. The young girl in red stood next to him and asked as an onlooker, so, you can make a choice. Do you want to change the trajectory of the train and let 5 people be run over and die, or do you want to change the direction and let the people on the other track die? What would you choose? Fatty Sue hesitated for a long time. The train rumbled along, and the dialogue between the people on the 2 tracks echoed in his mind as well. After a while, he let go of the joystick in his hands and took 2 steps back. I choose to do nothing. The girl in red asked, why? Fatty Sue said hesitantly, it's too difficult for me to decide the lives and deaths of others. So I simply don't think about it and let the train run on its own. Not considering my existence, this is what was supposed to happen. So it has nothing to do with me. Fatty Sue's explanation made the red-clad girl nod. Consider everything from the perspective of a bystander? Fatty Sue looked at the red-clad girl with some trepidation. At this time, the train was still moving rapidly, seemingly about to run over the people in front of it, but it was taking its time reaching the fork in the road. Will I pass? He didn't have high hopes for himself. After all, there was really nothing commendable about such a cowardly act of retreat. But the next moment, he saw the girl in red nod gently. You've passed. Fatty Sue was ecstatic, and a surprised smile spread across his face. As expected, I am a super genius. When the same problem was presented to Ichard, he did not hesitate to pull the lever after listening to the rules of the girl in red, diverting the giant steel castle and crushing the small one. Sacrificing the interests of the individual for the good of the collective is inevitable at times. The girl in red did not comment on his actions, but simply asked, so, what if the person sacrificed was you? Ichard still did not hesitate for a moment, and said with a calm gaze, me too. No one could lie in front of the red-clad girl. Lying in front of such a high-level being was an extremely foolish act. Therefore, what Ichard said was exactly what he truly thought. He could really sacrifice his life for the survival of the Tsang-era civilization. Because his existence had been too long-standing, life was not something he was very attached to. Not just him. Loridek, Plato's, the other 10 demon gods, and their companions who had self-destructed one after the other throughout the long ages, were all the same. Their sole objective for existing up to now was to ensure that the existence of the Tsang era could remain in this world. Because when a civilization is completely destroyed, with all living creatures gone, all traces of civilization will also dissipate with the wind. Then their existence will also be completely meaningless. The young girl in red nodded. You have passed this test. King Arthur, on the other hand, looked at the speeding train in front of him and, like Fatty Sue, let go of the lever. All men are born equal and free, and no one can decide another's life for them. If the price of saving these 5 people is to let another innocent person die, I firmly oppose it. Therefore, I will not change the direction of the train. The girl in red asked indifferently, but if you do nothing, it means you are going to watch 5 people on the track in front of you die. Do you think that is right? King Arthur answered without hesitation, I am not qualified to decide the life and death of others. If one life is used to save 5, that is also murder. As for the 5 people on the track in front of me, they would have died without me. King Arthur's answer was approved by the young woman in red, so he also passed this test and was transported to the next node. The Holy Roman Church, with its Cardinal, Archangel Michael, Death Knight, and many other titles, Arnold Olive, instead asked the question when faced with such a test. Are any of these people followers of the Holy Roman Church? The young cardinal girl replied, I don't know. Either they are all of them, or none of them. From an anthropological point of view, all their social attributes are exactly the same. Olive raised the silver cross hanging from his chest and kissed it. Then he said, Death is only returning to God's embrace, and it does not make people afraid. Only those who do not believe in God piously will fall into the underworld realm. Therefore, their lives and deaths should be decided by God. I will only pray for them, asking God to decide if they are guilty. A strange look flashed in the eyes of the young girl in red. At this moment, she understood human religion. Olive was then transported to the next node. When faced with this kind of problem, Deng Shentong hesitated for a long time, and ultimately chose to sacrifice that one person in exchange for the survival of the 5. Why did you make this choice? The young girl in red asked him calmly. Deng Shentong crossed his arms and put one hand on his chin, smiling as he answered, All men are created equal. That is indeed a very good slogan. But in reality, there has never been true equality in the world. For 99.99999% of the world's population, whether they are intelligent beings of a higher civilization, hyenas running on the savannah, or earthworms wriggling underground, their fate is determined from birth. Sheep have to avoid being hunted by wolves all their lives, and plants and trees are only nibbled. Even for humans, a higher creature, their fate is almost determined from birth. I don't believe in true equality in this world. Deng Shentong said very frankly. So whether it's saving 1 life or 5 lives, it's certainly a difficult choice. But I'd still choose to save that 1 life. After saying this, Deng Shentong waited for the young girl in red to make a comment. However, a gust of wind suddenly blew past in front of his eyes, and Deng Shentong subconsciously closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he suddenly found himself standing on top of a bridge. Do! The loud whistle of a train could be heard in the distance. Deng Shentong then realized that the scene in front of him had changed. He was standing on a bridge spanning the railway, and a train was speeding towards him from afar. In front of the train, there were still 5 people tied up, about to be run over. However, in front of Fatty Sue, there was also a person tied up. As soon as Fatty Sue gave a gentle push, he would immediately fall and land on the railway tracks. The young girl in red asked again, so, let's change the question slightly. Instead of 2 railway tracks, there is a living person in front of you. As long as you push him off, you can stop the train from moving forward and give the 5 people the power to live. Will you push him off? The young girl in red pointed at the man in front of her and asked in her emotionless voice. Deng Shentong looked at the man in front of him, and the shock in his heart grew even stronger for a time. Even though he knew that everything was fake, this kind of test was about the heart, and he had to face it as if it were real. He was required to push this innocent man down with his own hands and kill him in order to save the other 5 people? This was much more difficult than simply turning a joystick. Killing someone from a distance with a firearm is less of a burden than stabbing someone with a sword. If you can attack your enemy with a drone controlled by a computer mouse, it even gives you a sense of euphoria, and you don't feel guilty about killing. But in essence, there is no difference between these actions. The girl in red kept looking at Deng Shentong, waiting for him to give an answer. In front of Deng Shentong was the back of the man, and the train was approaching. In the end, when the train rumbled under the bridge, Deng Shentong did not intervene. His eyes were a little lost, because he felt that his self-contradictory approach was finished. Now, do you have anything you want to say? The girl in red asked. Deng Shentong closed his eyes, but soon he opened them again, his eyes incredibly firm at the moment. I still feel that there is nothing wrong with my idea. Not pushing him off is just an emotional and moral level of forbearance on the part of my biological self, but it doesn't mean that I think my point of view is wrong. When faced with this kind of situation where one party's interests must be sacrificed, the golden rule that humans have always followed is to choose the interests of the majority. Haven't humans always been doing multiple-choice questions? Even when they were just primitive people, when faced with a strong enemy, they would have to abandon the old, weak, sick, and disabled in the community. After the kingdom was established, women were sent to marry into other clans, putting them in the tiger's den, and even sacrificing their lives to preserve the survival of the group. Deng Shentong took a deep breath and said, "This is not simply a matter of right and wrong. Rather, it is a difficult choice that the collective had to make in order to survive for a long time." The cold voice of the young girl in red entered his ears. "You have passed. In the same valley." This time, young Shing Shin, dressed in black combat fatigues and with long, seaweed-like hair, was standing on the train. "Facing such a problem, what would you choose?" the red-clad girl asked calmly. Young Shing Shin looked at the forking path that was constantly approaching from ahead, but she knew very well that this was just an artificial illusion. There are only two choices, so the purpose of the test is not to see what the test taker does. Because there is never a correct answer to the trolley problem. Therefore, what you really want to test is the way the test taker answers the question. She looked at the two forks in the road ahead. Pointing her finger at the road with only one person, "If I choose to sacrifice the life of one person to save 5 people, then this is the principle of maximizing utility, choosing to sacrifice the interests of a small number of people in the collective to preserve the interests of the majority." But the biggest problem with the principle of maximizing utility is that this kind of completely equal relationship does not exist. If there really is such a dilemma, it is highly likely that there will be inequality in the status, position, wealth, and social connections of the 6 people. In particular, the closeness of the relationship with the person making the choice is an important factor that affects the choice. For example, if there is a person tied to the train tracks, and that person is your father, and the 5 people next to him are your enemies, then the principle of maximizing utility no longer applies. Human selfishness cannot be eliminated. After saying this, young Shing Shin pointed ahead again. If you choose not to divert the train, then it is the principle of freedom that is supreme. Human life should not be taken under this principle. Because everyone is born free and equal, no one has the right to decide the life and death of others. Therefore, I am not qualified to take away that person's life to achieve the so-called collective interest. The red-clad girl's eyes sparkled, and her gaze at young Shing Shin was full of admiration. Even in the face of a weak civilization, she still sensed something extraordinary in young Shing Shin. It was like when humans breed dog breeds and discover a breed called the border collie. It was a mixture of surprise and admiration. "So, if you had to choose, would you prefer the former or the latter?" In fact, by this point, the red-clad girl had already given young Shing Shin the go-ahead. But she wanted to ask more to see how the other would reply. Young Shing Shin did not give a direct answer to the train's question, because from the beginning, it was clear that it was not the crux of the matter, but a formality, like Schrödinger's cat. So she said, "The question of how to make a choice is actually about standard setting. Which should come first, the collective interest or the individual interest? It depends on whether you are willing to define a certain standard as a universal law when you propose it." She slowly opened her white palm and looked the young girl in red in the eye. "In other words, whether you choose the former or the latter, it must be applicable in all circumstances. Even if you are on the tracks yourself, you will still follow the law." At this point, there was no need for further words. Because there is no correct answer to this question itself, and what the young girl in red wanted was to understand the cognitive and understanding ability of life of creatures under the civilization of the test taker. She gave young Shing Shin a rare smile. Very interesting point of view. There was no need to continue with the experiment, and the young girl in red directly gave young Shing Shin the verdict that she had passed. The question came to Jangi's side. The young girl in red stood next to Jangi and said to him, "Now what are you going to choose?" Is it to divert the train and sacrifice one person to save the lives of 5 people? Or do you just let the train continue on its way, killing the 5 people in front of it without making any changes? At this time, the voices of the people on the 2 paths also rang in Jangi's head. The person on the road with 5 people said, "It's a good deal to trade one person's life for the lives of the 5 of us. And if you do nothing, you're just watching us die. Now you see, things have become connected to you, and you can't just pretend you know nothing." The person on the road with 1 person also said, "I wasn't supposed to die. If you change the trajectory of the train, you're murdering my life." Jangi frowned, paused for at least a second, and then decisively and without hesitation pulled the lever. The train veered in the middle and took another path. The person tied to that path was run over and killed. Seeing Jangi's decisiveness, the girl in red quickly changed the scene again. This time, Jangi was standing on a bridge, and a speeding train was coming from afar. He had to choose whether to push the person in front of him onto the tracks to stop the train. This time, Jangi chose to do nothing.